We are live on Zoom.
So, good day and welcome to all our participants on today's webinar. My name is Charlie Spillane. I'm from the Irish Forum for International Agricultural Development. Just to give you some overview of our forum, we're basically a multi-stakeholder platform in Ireland, representing the government agencies, state agencies, universities, NGOs, and also civil society organizations, farmers' bodies, to really bring together all actors involved in international agricultural development in Ireland. So if you want to know more about our forum, we welcome new members, and we'd like to have more engagement from anybody or any institutions that are interested. If you go to www.ifiad.ie, or you can follow us on Twitter at Ifiad Ireland. So today we have a really interesting webinar that we have put together with some fascinating speakers. The topic for today is really quite pertinent. It's we're focused on the COVID crisis and really how to address key information gaps in food systems research and activities under COVID-19 restrictions. For the past months, we've had all of us globally, and we still continue to experience mobility restrictions and other forms of shocks to our everyday activities, and this is also felt in relation to the food systems globally. So we have 4 speakers, we have 3 presentations, all outstanding individuals working at the coalface of food systems activities with smallholder farmers and impoverished communities. So I'll just step through the various presenters at the moment, and I'd like to welcome all four of our presenters. Our first speaker will be Sean Ferris. Sean is Director of Agriculture and Livelihood Programme at the Catholic Relief Services, CRS. And Sean has over 30 years of experience working with international development organizations, including the CG system, FAO, and of course, CRS. So he's currently managing a team of senior advisors and supporting smallholder farmers along their pathways to prosperity, and looking at agripreneurial capacity of farmers groups, and also last mile field agents. Sean's presentation he'll be joined by Austin Moore, who's a senior technical advisor with the Agriculture and Livelihoods Programme also for CRS. And Austin is involved in longer term agriculture development, particularly transitioning farmers from emergency assistance. He's currently refining the smart skills agriculture curricula, building resilience programming and measurement capacity, and also monitoring markets. Our third speaker is going to be a presentation from the World Food Programme. We've got Kusum Hatchertu, who's a food security and nutrition analyst at WFP. And Kusum, she's a food security analyst. Her background is as a nutritionist. She's been specializing in design and implementation of food security and nutrition monitoring systems, including remote monitoring systems. So Kusum is going to give us an overview of remote monitoring possibilities and how WFP has been approaching that. Then our third presentation will be from the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. We have Lynette Neufeld, who's the Director of Knowledge Leadership within GAIN, and she's involved in generation and use of evidence to strengthen the quality of design and implementation of nutrition programs in low and middle income countries. Lynette has over 25 years of experience in the field of nutrition and is the incoming president of the International Union for Nutrition Scientists. So at that, I'd like to welcome our 4 speakers. Look forward to fascinating overviews of how they're dealing with the key information gaps in food systems research, and hand over to Rob, who will go through some of the technical aspects of how we'll move forward through the webinar. So thanks and welcome to everybody.
Thank you, Charlie. And welcome to everybody. Just to give you a broad overview of the webinar today. The webinar will be 1 hour long. We'll have 3 presentations today given by 4 speakers. And each speaker will present for approximately 10 minutes, and that will hopefully leave us with plenty of time for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Before we start, let's go over a couple of the technical guidelines for the webinar. You can use the chat feature at the bottom of your screens there to, for those of us joining through Zoom, of course, can use the chat feature to contact me about any technical issues you may be having, and I'll do my best to try and resolve them. Just make sure you select all panelists in the chat box before sending the message. You can use the Q&A feature down the bottom also of your screen to submit your questions to our speakers. Include the name or names of the speaker or speakers you wish to direct your question to. We'll try and get through as many as we possibly can at the end of the webinar, so please do ask away at any time during the webinar. You can also anonymize your questions if you like, so don't be shy. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the IFIAD YouTube channel, and a link to that will be sent to you following the completion of the webinar. And yeah, so greetings to those also who are joining us through the IFIAD YouTube channel live stream. Okay, so on to our first presentation. We have Sean Ferris and Austin Moore from Catholic Relief Services, and they'll present on the approach of the Catholic Relief Services Agriculture and Livelihoods team to addressing information gaps in food systems under COVID-19. So please go ahead, Sean and Austin.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Rob and Charlie, for the invitation. It's great to be with you today. We're going to be talking about what is CRS doing in terms of working with our teams across the globe. CRS works with about 100 different countries, so it's an organization where there's a lot of different things happening in many different places. So Austin is going to give you, my colleague is going to give you some insights into how we have been trying to synthesize our information, but really what we'd like to just talk about is how do we go through these different levels of the information that we'd like to talk about. Obviously, when the COVID situation hit, our primary approach was really to look at safety issues. So we wanted to make sure that our teams were safe and the communities that we were working with are safe. But after that, really, we want to be able to find information to be able to make sensible decisions about our programming. And also particularly looking at different types of segments of the people that we're working in, be that in the rural areas where we mainly work, but also in the urban settings as well. So let me just hand over to Austin, who's going to walk you through the basic process of how we set up the information systems. And then I'll come back a little bit later to talk about some longer term ideas. So over to you, Austin.
Great, thank you, Sean. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, great. All right, so first, to provide a little background about how CRS is approaching its agricultural livelihoods response to COVID. Being that CRS is largely a decentralized organization with many country programs operating around the globe, a lot of action took place immediately. As Sean noted, there was an immediate transition to emergency assistance programming, whereby country programs were refurbishing their efforts to focus on addressing COVID as it related to our different levels of beneficiaries. In terms of agricultural programming, a lot of the shift occurred in terms of remote delivery to allow for social distancing and to consider the lack of mobility for a lot of our teams and our beneficiaries themselves. And so at headquarters, given that so many adaptations were happening at the country level, it was necessary to kind of bring together the best practices into a cohesive agency strategy. And this strategy document is sort of the guide for how we are approaching the COVID response as an agency. This strategy involved the phased approach, focusing initially on the emergency response phase, largely cash voucher assistance, safe marketplaces, et cetera, as Sean noted. And this was led by our humanitarian response departments, or our emergency assistance colleagues, with a secondary phase focusing more on the longer term agricultural thinking. As it happened, this led to a far closer collaboration between these two phases, which pre-COVID had tended to operate a bit more in isolation, but there was obviously a need to integrate better given the rapid response required for COVID. Next slide, please. Great, so this is the agency strategy as it stands. I'll just draw your attention quickly to some of the components of the results framework. Under the first strategic objective, which is around health, the first two immediate results are immediate term. So adopting preventative measures health systems providing quality COVID-19 services. Immediate result 1.3 starts to look a bit more towards the future in terms of providing ongoing services related to COVID. Similarly, under strategic objective 2, intermediate result 2.2 is another forward-thinking component of our strategy. So the majority of it focuses on addressing the immediate needs, especially food and other essential needs. But on the ag livelihood side, we are looking at providing some continuity in terms of livelihoods and making sure that individuals and especially farmers are able to restart their livelihoods should things loosen up a bit under COVID. And so there's a clear focus on the immediate term, but also a bit of a focus on the future and taking that next step towards recovery. Next slide, please. So while the strategy provides a nice guide, countries were also operating, quickly. They were making decisions quickly and making adaptations, immediately, often without much evidence. And this was not due to the fact that there wasn't information out there. In fact, information systems that we all rely on have in fact come a long way in the last several decades. There is a lot of secondary information being gathered. A lot of different agencies are tracking prices, markets, household impacts of COVID. WFP-VAM is one example. Some of the REACH reports and Mercy Corps reports that we access in the US were other examples. But the problem that our country programs were facing was that there was, in essence, too much data. And it was hard to know what to do with the different data points and how to take, again, all these databases and all this data and turn it into tangible action. So we recognized quite early that our country programs needed more curation of the data, some synthesis, some sort of extraction of the highlights and how they can be used. And so this was something that we at headquarters within CRS took on as a challenge to make the data work better for implementing programming. Next slide, please. So to approach this, we used a two-pronged data collection approach. One focused on rapid and remote data collection to identify red flags for immediate programming and/or humanitarian assistance. So this is meant to be quick, agile, produce data in very short term so that country programs can turn around and take action. And a tool entitled the COVID Markets and Supply Chain Monitoring Tool, or Toolkit, was developed for this need. Beyond that, there is a longer-term data collection approach that we use called Measurement Indicators for Resilience Assessment, or MIRA, which looks at coping mechanisms and resilience with the idea that COVID presents an opportunity for us to build in resilience into existing programming. Naturally, this was happening already to a degree, but COVID provided a unique opportunity and entry point. And so basically, we wanted to have some more monitoring, which is the COVID Markets and Supply Chain Monitoring tool that allowed country programs and our projects to be more agile in the immediate term, but also to think more long-term in building some of those resilience capacities that will serve our beneficiaries and our end users beyond just COVID. Next slide, please. Right, so this is the first of the two tools. This is a tool that was developed internally between our Ag Livelihoods team and our Humanitarian Response Department. This basically tracks the impacts of COVID at multiple levels, 3 levels to be precise. The first being households, so how are households are responding or being impacted by COVID, but also looking at marketplaces and ports and border crossings. The thinking here being that when goods are stuck somewhere in the supply chain, the impacts aren't initially seen at the household level, but ultimately they're coming. And so we've seen multiple examples of where containers are held at a port due to, say, lack of mobility of port staff. And so as a result, we'll see price spikes at the marketplace level about a week or 2 down the line. And so that, of course, then leads to even higher price spikes for households down the line. So we're able to kind of integrate these different components of the markets so that we can get a holistic picture of what's coming and be able to proactively support our end users and our beneficiaries. Key to this initiative is that the data is collected bi-weekly. Being that COVID produces such immediate impacts and that there's a lot of variability between typical intervals of 1 month or greater, we felt that this was needed. It's currently used in 11 countries. It's been highly customized for food and non-food items based on the needs of our countries. And a key component of this is the summary reports or the curation of data, as I mentioned, that's provided back to countries so that they can make evidence-based programming decisions. Next slide, please. So this is a quick example of a piece of one of the reports that we provide back. Obviously, there's quite a bit more data. This is one component, but it allows country programs and our teams there to make quick decisions. And so this is from Sierra Leone, and I would just highlight the third bullet point in the key findings and analysis column that notes that all households reported livelihood concerns. This is also reflected in the red graphic box on the far right. And so we were able to look at this finding, which is not shocking, but what helps us is to dig into it a bit more and identify that the price of inputs, so lack of input availability and the high input costs that are being voiced by the respondents of this survey gives us sort of a roadmap as to how to address this livelihood concerns moving forward. And so in the case of some of our programmings, this could involve input subsidies, voucher programs, or basically clearing the path however other way is possible to ensure that especially agricultural beneficiaries have the inputs needed to restart their production, so that when COVID lets up a bit, assuming it does, that they're ready to take that next step and restart their livelihoods and their production. And so next slide. And at this point, I'll hand off to Sean to talk about our other tools.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. So Austin has been through the data collection system so that we can get an understanding of what is happening in the transfer of goods and with these sort of specific spot survey ideas. The other thing that we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years is developing a system which is basically a high frequency monitoring process with communities. So this is more of a long-term resilience tool. So we are going into communities, gathering data on a monthly basis, and then collecting information on multiple shocks that are happening to people. So if you can think about this, Austin is describing a survey process, which is quite frequent, but generally this is a snapshot. When we go to the mirror process, this is much more like watching a movie. So you're actually seeing processes and information travel through time, which is what that graph is showing you. And it's also showing you multiple types of shocks so that we can start to see one thing and how it affects another. So this is a tool that we have been sort of testing and piloting for a few years, but now we're starting to bring this into much more mainstream. And once again, COVID provides us an opportunity where this kind of information becomes very important. And this is interesting as a tool because it allows us to collect data ourselves, analyze it, and then pass that information back to our response teams, but also to the communities directly. Next slide, Rob. And so, what sort of information are we getting back on this? So on the left-hand side, you can see this is just 2 months of responses from a number of people in the panels where we do these analyses. And it's showing you the price report of rice, one of these imported crops. And these are one of the things that we were really concerned about. Countries are heavily dependent on imports. How is that affecting their food security? And you can see just between these 2 months, April to May, going from an amber that prices have increased to prices have increased a lot in May. So that means that we know that people are starting to pay a lot more for the food that they are having in their traditional diets. And you can also see on the right-hand side what is actually happening to the different people within the communities and the households. And you can see that income, this sort of, the lifeblood of the communities, men have earned a lot less income in the last month. And that means that we know that that share of income across those households has received a huge shock. So if you remember that previous graph, this is the type of thing that we're monitoring, and we can see how it's starting to affect people's coping responses, as they deal with COVID plus other things like drought, disease that are affecting their situation. So I know we're short on time, so just go to the final slide. And this is really just to say, as Austin was mentioning, we know that country programs are collecting information. What we found is that they're not collecting the type of data that provides them with a more holistic view of the food security of their programming in the context of their, the environment of the project, but also the country. So we felt that strengthening those systems was really important. I think that this idea of this much more curated information is really important. People actually don't like lots of data. It's complicated for them to deal with. So we have to set up systems that actually allow people to understand what information they're getting and for them to be able to make sensible decisions based on that. So there's a lot of feedback between the people collecting the data, doing the curation, and the people actually receiving it. And I think for us in the future, marrying this idea of short-term sort of snapshot analyses with this long-term monitoring within the communities is really going to give us the best types of data. And we think that's a powerful thing because it not only provides us with data, it provides the community with information to respond as well. So, I think that's a really important part of this process. And yeah, this is something that we will be refining, but I think it does provide us and our programs with a fairly good understanding about where they are now, where the gaps are in their knowledge, but that they can make better decisions based on more curated data that's being shared between analysts and the people doing the programming. Rob, let me stop there. We'll take questions after, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean and Austin. So let me go to the next slide here. Okay. Now we're delighted to welcome our third speaker, Kusum Haji too, who will give a presentation on real-time food security monitoring in the time of COVID-19. So please go ahead, Kusum.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you so much, Ifyat, for the opportunity to speak today. Really delighted to speak on behalf of WFP on how we leverage some of our remote data collection methodologies to track food security trends in general, but specifically also in the time of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So just I'll start with a quick introduction to the World Food Programme. Our biggest mandate at World Food Programme is to fight hunger and promote food security in the 83 plus countries where we work. And to be able to do that, we really, to be able to drive our programs with evidence-based data, what we really need to know is who are the vulnerable people, where are they located, what specific types of assistance do they need, how are specific types of shocks, whether it's crisis or drought or COVID affecting their lives and livelihoods. And really to answer all that question, this is all to say that food security monitoring or assessment is really an integral part of WFP to drive our programmatic decisions around targeting, around interventions. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, but also then to make that data available to our partners, to governments, and to the broader development and humanitarian community. For example, the information we collect on food security around household food access and coping behaviors, food-based and livelihood-based coping behaviors is widely used by the integrated phase classification process, which is used to assess the severity and magnitude of food insecurity. So that's just a bit on the World Food Programme and food security assessment or surveillance at World Food Programme. We collect data on a continuous basis in all the countries where we work. We collect data also from some of the most remote and inaccessible areas in these countries. We leverage all kind of modalities to collect food security data, whether it's regular face-to-face surveys or whether it's satellite data or whether it's remote tools, which I will delve into in detail in the next slides. Next slide, please. So the question is really, how does WFP collect data, real-time data, from places that are too remote or inaccessible face-to-face inaccessible for face-to-face service And this is especially relevant in the current context of COVID. And the other question is also that how do we collect data in a high frequency or a continuous basis? Because as we know, hunger or food security is not static. It's a dynamic thing. It changes. There are various factors in play that affects food security and livelihoods, whether it's shocks or seasonality or various factors. So the other idea is to be able to collect data regularly on a continuous basis to track the trends and to also be able to quickly assess the impact of any kind of shock on household food security and their livelihoods. Next slide, please. You can click further, that would be great. So I'll start talking. So it was really in 2013 that we started with something that we used to call MVAM, Mobile Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping, which is now called the Hunger Monitoring. And the idea was to be able to collect data from areas that were affected by crisis, areas that were inaccessible for us, and areas where we couldn't send our enumerators to do surveys because it's too risky. So it started actually in 2013. So it's not a new concept for us. We've been doing this for 7 years now. Already pre-COVID, we were collecting data in a lot of countries, but in 14 countries, we had a national level remote food security monitoring in place. And when I speak of remote monitoring, just to give a quick explanation on how it works, it's essentially doing surveys remotely through phone surveys by leveraging call center operators. So that's essentially the concept. It's essentially a survey or assessment similar to that, just the modality is different. But of course, there is a lot of guidelines around how to do remote surveys. So just to explain how it works. So the data is collected, thank you very much. So the data is collected remotely through phone surveys. And as I said, in the 30 plus countries where we have scaled up right now, data collection is done every day. So it's not a one-time point, it's not every few months, it's done every day on a daily basis. We get the data automated through an API with the 2 days of lag. The analysis is also automated, and the visualization of data is also automated, which I'll show later on. So the entire process is automated such that between data collection and data visualization, there's a 2-day gap, and the analysis is updated on a daily basis. So if you look at the food security trends, which I'll show later on, it's every day we get new updated results with the window of analysis that we do. That's all automated. Because we collect data in such large volume, the entire analysis process is automated. Yeah, so that's just a bit on how it works. And I think I already went over sort of the advantages of this, the ability to get timely results from the data we collect, the ability to make more timely and evidence-based programmatic decisions for WFP, but also for other organizations. Next slide, please. And yeah, so I already spoke a lot about the speed, but what's really important to highlight is also the flexibility to collect all different types of information. So just to give an example, we have been collecting data on our signature or our corporate food security indicators, mostly around food access, household food consumption, and coping behaviors. But when the COVID hit, we were quickly able to add new questions to assess the impact of COVID on some of the other types of indicators. For example, to assess the impact of COVID on access to basic services, access to food, access to market, access to health services, or in terms of livelihoods, the flow of remittances, income sources, all of that, we were able to do it very quickly. In addition to tracking the food security trends pre and post-COVID, we were also able to add information very quickly. Cost effectiveness is another example of remote food security service, because of the logistics cost around face-to-face surveys that we avoid with remote surveys. Next slide, please. So as I said before, really in terms of this system wasn't a new system for us. When the COVID hit, we already had established remote monitoring systems in various countries where we were tracking food security trends on a continuous basis. With this infrastructure, we were able to assess the impact of COVID-19 on household food security and livelihoods and quickly scale up to other countries. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to also give a very quick information on remote surveys around methodologies and best practices. I think we could spend a day talking about this, but just to talk about some of the best practices. In terms of survey design, it should be designed in the same way as you design a face-to-face survey with robust sampling and everything. We just have to be careful of the sampling universe, whether it's a program monitoring type of data collection or whether it's an assessment type of data collection that needs to be representative at the population level. But the drill is the same as face-to-face surveys. In terms of question type, an important thing to highlight is that the questions need to be kept very simple, considering that it's a phone survey. So there are certain methodologies around adapting a typical face-to-face survey for a phone survey. Specific guidelines around that. Length cannot be very long, and optimal length we say is 15 minutes, considering data quality and everything. So that's also another thing to keep in mind. In terms of the analysis, I think one thing I would really like to highlight is the potential biases around phone surveys or remote surveys. There are certain types of biases that can be corrected, and there are certain types of biases that are just inherited. For example, the mode bias, which we say just the fact that you ask questions over the phone, the response might be different from when you ask it face to face. That's sort of like an inherent that's just a bias we cannot control for. But there are other types of biases that we can control for. For example, the sampling biases. Just to give an example, often we find that with phone surveys, we're capturing perhaps better off household in terms of education level. We can put pre-stratification and post-stratification weights to correct for that. We put also population weights to account for geographical representativity. So there's all kinds of methodologies to de-bias any potential biases around phone surveys. Next slide, please. And then just to quickly go over some of the visualization products that we have in this process. So recently what we've been doing is we've been putting out a weekly hunger and COVID snapshots. If you go to hungermap.wfp.org, you would see on the left top side, weekly hunger and COVID snapshots. If you click there, you can get the snapshots by country. It shows the food security trends, but as well as changes in a lot of other variables like market access, food access, health access, and coping strategies, comparing it with the week before. The food security trends are daily, but then the other types of indicators we're showing changes, weekly changes. And then if you go to hungermap.wfp.org, you will find a page for each country where you can find daily food security trends. And it will, the majority of it are predictions. So in the 30 countries where we're actually collecting data on a continuous basis, it's the real data. Where we are not collecting data on a continuous basis, we use historical data to come up with predictions. So that's just to give an overview on some of the products that we have. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Kasub. Very interesting insights there. Okay, now we're delighted to welcome our fourth speaker, Lynette Neufeld, who will give a presentation on data and information for resilient food and market systems. Please go ahead, Lynette.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
All good.
Okay, there we go. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start a little bit generally and then come to some specific data that's been collected. But I want to talk a little bit first about the data needs and how we can start to think about the priorities around data needs, not only immediately, but in moving forward. So first of all, as everyone knows, the COVID-19 crisis is causing simultaneous shocks to food and nutrition systems and market systems. The economic shocks we've been hearing about in terms of lost wages, food price volatility increases, social shocks related to lockdowns, uncertainty, border closures, market closures, and of course the obvious immediate and direct health shocks that we are seeing from the burden of disease coming from COVID itself. The next slide. We were not prepared for these shocks in our food and nutrition systems, and nor did we have the information needed to address them as the crisis started to unfold. However, many of the things that we are facing now are not new. The magnitude and breadth that they are affecting across the global systems is new, but many of these same issues have been affecting different parts of the world and different countries due to different types of crises for a very long time. Many groups have developed frameworks to try to guide the information needs to address improvements in food and nutrition and agricultural systems. And I'm just showing you one example here that was developed by in collaboration with USAID and really looks at the information needs for systems response. Thinking first at the top of their analogy of the iceberg, what is happening as a response to these issues, the events that we're seeing, the outcomes that we're seeing as a result of the problems, that is the tip of the iceberg as they've illustrated here. But then to understand further the problem that we are facing, and even more importantly, to start to think about the solutions to address them, we really need to go beyond the tip of that iceberg, looking at patterns and trends, looking at the underlying structures that underpin those patterns and trends, what are the influences of those patterns, the relationships among the different parts. And of course, down below, to really think about transformation, we need to understand assumptions, beliefs, perceptions, values, and how all of that fits together within food and market systems. As we've been hearing and as we've seen in so many webinars and websites that are popping up, we're seeing a proliferation of data initiatives that are very much focused at the top of our iceberg. Importantly, it's a critical information, as have been pointed out by the previous two speakers, to respond immediately and act immediately. And there's also some very interesting novel approaches going on to looking at the trends and the patterns and tracking over time. Next slide, please. But to move from that to understanding more profoundly, we need to look at more information and look deeper underneath not only what the patterns and the trends are, but look at what is happening, how are people responding, and what are the problems and the issues they're facing. I want to spend a little bit of time showing you some of the work that we've been doing at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. As a bit of background, we are a Swiss-based NGO and we work on a mission to improve the consumption of nutritious, safe foods for all people, especially the most vulnerable. We have country offices in 9 countries across Asia and Africa, and focus on 9 different programmatic areas, all intending to improve the availability, affordability, and consumption, ultimately, of safe and nutritious foods. What I'm going to show you is a little bit of what we have been doing in terms of collecting some evidence around what is happening to small and medium-sized nutritious food producing companies in Africa and in Asia. So why have we focused on SMEs? And this is just a little bit of a context to tell you why we chose to focus on SMEs as our work, as a big part of our work generally at GAIN, but also as a part of our COVID response work. As you can see, both in terms of, these are generated from existing evidence across countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And what you can see is that much of the fruit and vegetable consumed and much of the cereals and legumes are being produced among micro and small sized enterprises. So this is a critically important component of the food system, and particularly so for low-income consumers across Africa and parts of Asia as well. Next slide, please. In the immediate response to COVID, in collaboration with the Sun Business Network, which is a network of focusing on strengthening business for nutrition, which is co-chaired by the World Food Programme and GAIN, we conducted a survey, online survey, a voluntary opt-in online survey with nutritious food producing small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa and Asia, and asked them questions about how COVID is affecting their business, and then some of the response that they are taking in adaptation to that. We had 17 responses from SMEs in 17 countries across Africa and Asia. 28% of the business owners who responded were women from women-owned SMEs. They're all nutritious food producing SMEs. And I wanted to highlight here that 59% considered that their business has been considerably or severely affected by the COVID-19 crisis. An additional 38% had been moderately affected, but to date had been managing to cope within that effect. And just putting here a quote from one of the business owners in Rwanda, who found it impossible to continue business given the unpaid and disappearing clients as a caused from the pandemic. Next slide, please. We asked the businesses to provide us with some information about what actions they had taken to address the challenges that they were facing. We also asked them to help us understand what they might like to see from government, what they might like to see in terms of financial, technical support. And I'm not going to show all of those results. The link to the report, it is an online report, is on the previous slide, and you're welcome to download that from the webpage. But what we found was that businesses were affected in many different ways, as you would be able to see from the report. I haven't put all of those details up, but I think that it's important to note that many of them found ways to adapt. Sometimes, in 30% of those cases, that included downsizing their staff, contributing further to the challenges that we've been looking at in terms of lost income for the former employees of these businesses. But they also found ways to adapt their supply chains, adapt their communications, their customers, their advertising, their delivery, their sales hours, etc., to try to keep in business and to maintain the sales of nutritious food during this time. Many of them, almost 80%, identified a need for financial support or some type of incentive for the business for supporting their worker populations. They also found other ways that they could be supported even including such areas as keeping borders open, given that some of the challenges that they were facing were the lack of essential supplies being reached for them to continue to produce the nutritious foods that they produce. So this information was used by us to inform our Keeping Food Markets Working program, which is the COVID response program that is a multi-donor funded program now being implemented by GAIN. It has 5 components. SME support is one of those, both technical and financial support to keep businesses open and selling nutritious food. Food fortification, supplies particularly. There are several places where premix has been difficult to obtain due to border closures. So we're working to mitigate that issue for companies that are fortifying staple foods. We are working in expanding. One of our programming areas is workforce nutrition. And so we have expanded that to work specifically with food producing businesses to ensure the safety and continued income of their worker populations. Working on safety within markets, again, compliance with safety procedures, looking at the need for adjusting market access and market movement so that markets don't close. And finally, the last is to keep updating this type of information so that information can be available as quickly as possible to adapt as needed in terms of keeping these programs responsive to the needs that are happening on the ground. And last slide, please. So to bring this back to the framework that we were discussing, many organizations, GAIN and many others that we've been hearing about, have been able to rapidly adapt information systems to provide crucial insights into the impact of COVID and some of the patterns and challenges that we're facing. And these have been used across all of the organizations that we've been hearing about to provide reactive responses to address some of the challenges immediately. But we can't be satisfied with that. We were not prepared for this crisis, and if we don't change and transform in a different way to increase resilience, we won't be ready for the next crisis. And that requires doing things differently in the data that we have, in the extent that we are able to address changes in the food system to become more resilient to shocks and crises, and more in favor generally of nutrition. And these are urgent calls that had been sounded long before this crisis hit. And I just want to draw your attention before closing to 2 initiatives related to that. Obviously, the Food Systems Summit was to take place in December this year. It has now been postponed until 2021. But that is an important event in which the UN and other organizations will come together to try to advance the agenda around transforming food systems. And GAIN, together with the partners that you can see on the picture here on the side of the slide, we've developed a food systems dashboard, which we hope right now is compiling existing information related to food systems across many different aspects of food systems, and allows for the generation of country profiles, and in the next few months will allow for generation of decision points and action points that come from those from that data that hopefully will be used to inform needed transformations within food systems in countries. So I draw your attention there. The dashboard is live. It's new and continually being updated, but we hope that going beyond COVID, it will help inform food systems transformations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynette, and thank you to all of our speakers. Some really great and useful insights and recommendations there. So we do have about 10 minutes left now for our Q&A session, and we have plenty of questions here, which is great. The first question we'll put out to Sean. What does the panel think about how better coordination can occur across agencies with regard to sharing national COVID-related data for food security? Whose responsibility is it?
Yeah, great question. I was trying to answer that, but I couldn't quite make the system work there. But no, I think there are many levels to this. I think the first thing is that different organizations should definitely be finding ways to meet and talk about these opportunities or these options of information that they have. So there's obviously the food security clusters that are meeting. I think in most countries, there's also some sort of food security council that meets on a regular basis. And I think that, there's a whole raft of NGOs that are collecting information, governments collecting information, and you've got these international organizations providing, exceptionally good information. So the question then is, how do you get those people to meet, to discuss, and figure out what's important? And then not to have, a total, situation where everybody's collecting the same information and not being able to share them. So I think that really comes down to countries and communities coming together, setting up those regular meeting points where people can actually discuss data. And I think a little bit complicated now because of the COVID situation, not so easy to go to meeting points, but using a lot of virtual platforms now, I think we can bring people together quickly. But as Austin said, if you've got good information, it has to be well curated so that the right people can see what the opportunities are. And I think that's one of the big problems is we have a lot of data, but it's getting the right kind of analysts in there so that the information, is actionable. And that's one of the things that I think we need to really think about, getting the right analysts to look at that data. Over.
Super, thank you very much, Sean. Okay, our next question is for Kusum. Let me see, we have a few questions for Kusum. So we have a question here, how best can you ensure a representative sample when using phone or remote surveying moving forward?
Okay, I can take that one. And I think the next question, if I remember, is also very similar around biases. So
yes,
I could try to answer both of them in one response. That's a very interesting question. And that's something we've been working on for 7 years now, from my side, 4 years. So I would say, let me answer the bias question first and then get to the representative sample. So for any type of phone survey, I think there's 2 types of biases we need to be really aware of. One is the mode bias, just the modality bias, which we can't control, and the other is the sampling bias, right? So in order to de-bias the sampling bias, there's 2 things we can do. One, factoring in various things during the design of the survey, and another during the analysis. So in the design of during the design phase, in order to ensure a representative sample, it's essentially, of course, there's always the bias that those who don't have phone are not included, but there are certain things we can do to ensure, for example, geographical representativity. For example, just to give an example, if we want data representative for a certain province in a country, and there are 10 districts within that province, we can put quotas, or we can do pre-stratification using something like a population proportion to size. So we get everyone in that area has an equal chance of being selected, and we get a representative sample. So this is something that's done for face-to-face surveys as well, and this is something we can do for phone surveys as well. Even after doing that, if we don't get a representative sample, I'm only speaking of the representativity in terms of like population right now, we can put weights, we can put population weights in the analysis phase to correct for that. The other biggest one is the sampling bias, that, just looking at the social demographic profile of the households we capture from phone surveys and comparing that with the census or large scale survey like DHS. Often we find that it's different, and the only way to correct for that is, again, to use weights using what's considered the gold oftentimes it's DHS or other big surveys like that, use that distribution as our way to correct for the bias in our data. And I don't know if I answered that in simple words, but so basically this is what we do from our side to get to de-bias the data we get.
Super, thank you very much, Kusum. So now we have a question for Lynette. We have an attendee who's wondering if the question on action to address challenges were asked to SMEs in an open question format or with a predetermined list of actions. Were there any really surprising responses or trends?
Thanks for the question. So we included options, predetermined list of options, because this was an online survey, but we also, and the respondents could tick as many as they felt were appropriate, but they also left room for additional responses to be added and for comments generally to be included. And several of the responses that you see did come from those free listing as well as from the predetermined options. I think from my perspective, the surprising result was that many of the business owners who responded felt that the crisis was helping them identify new opportunities for their business in nutritious foods. 43% noted in some way a new business model or a new business opportunity for expanding their business, for identifying new sales routes. I think, to me, the surprising thing was how much the crisis was sparking innovation in terms of keeping their business going, and how many of them identified specifically the importance of nutritious food in this context, and they felt a part of the response that is needed to make sure that nutritious food stays on the tables of consumers. Now, of course, as I noted, just like we've talked about with all of the other surveys, this survey was a opt-in survey, so it may have been responded by the most motivated business owners. And in the future work that we're going to be doing, we're going to try to reach out a bit more proactively to see if we can get a broader base of SME responses to try to challenge some of the findings that we had there and make sure that we can verify some of the findings that we saw there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lynette. So I'm mindful of our time now. If you go to the question and answer feature, you will see that some other questions have been written, questions have been answered with typed answers by Sean, I think there. But beyond that, I think we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. So I'll just hand things over to Charlie now for any final thoughts from him.
Thanks very much, Rob. And thanks to our wonderful speakers for what was really a fascinating kind of session, and also for all of the audience for their comments and questions, I think, which pushed the audience, pushed the panelists a bit. Just a few kind of wrap up kind of thoughts for myself. Both Albert Einstein and Frank Zappa highlighted that information is not knowledge, and I think one take-home message from this webinar, I think, from all the speakers, is that there's quite a lot of data, but there's a need to curate that data, both as continuous data streams, but also as snapshot surveys. And Kusum highlighted the importance of sampling design and to avoid bias, which can affect decision making. So to be careful on that front. And then just to finish with what Lynette highlighted, and I think just as a take-home message for all of us, is that while we may be getting better at evidence-informed reactive responses, so the data may be curated for very good reactive responses, there is a need to transition to curated data sources to inform food systems transformations, and in particular, to strengthen food systems resilience. And so I think that's the kind of next challenge for the data side, for aiding decision-making to enable those kind of transitions to other resilient states for our food systems. So on that note, I'd like to thank everybody and hope to have you all back again for future. If you have webinars, I'd like to thank Rob for putting together a great show, and our speakers today for taking the time out, and also our audience. So thank you. Back to you, Rob.